Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be talking about panentheism. And if you've ever struggled with how to understand God's presence in the world without just collapsing into pantheism or drifting too far into a classical theism that leaves God detached from creation, then this is a concept that you might find really resonates with you. We're going to explore this fascinating philosophical space and how panentheism really tries to hold both God's transcendence and God's immanence together in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and I think what's exciting for our listeners, who I know come to this show with their philosophical toolkits ready to go, is that we're going to treat this as more than just an introductory overview. We really want to dig into the nuance, the historical arguments, and the contemporary debates that swirl around this concept of panentheism. And our hope is that we can unpack its intellectual architecture by drawing on a range of sources that really highlight its historical roots and its diverse modern expressions.
And I think that's the perfect way to put it. This is an intellectual workout. We're going to dissect the core ideas of panentheism. What does it actually mean to say that all is in God and God is in all? How has this idea evolved through centuries of philosophical and theological thought? And how does panentheism stand up to some of the key criticisms that any robust philosophical position needs to address? That's our mission today, to leave you with a much deeper understanding of panentheism and its place within philosophical theology. And yes, we will be referencing the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on panentheism as a reliable guide through this landscape.
So, to kick things off, let's establish some of the essential terminology. Understanding panentheism's unique vocabulary, especially in contrast to concepts like classical theism and pantheism, is crucial for grasping its distinctiveness, especially for those approaching it from a philosophical perspective.
Absolutely. So let's start with classical theism. What comes to mind when you think about how classical theism understands God?
Well, in classical theism, God is primarily understood as transcendent, radically beyond and distinct from the created world.
Right, and this transcendence often comes as a package deal. It includes ideas like ontological distinction, immutability, impassibility, and timelessness.
Exactly. Ontological distinction means God's being is fundamentally different from ours. Immutability is the idea that God doesn't change. Impassibility means God is unaffected by the world. And timelessness places God outside our linear experience of time.
It's a powerful picture of God's sovereignty, but I can see how, for panentheists, it might create a gap between God and creation. It makes you wonder, how can a being that's utterly outside of space and time genuinely interact with a world that exists within space and time? It feels like a bit of a puzzle.
It does. And while classical theism affirms God's immanence, that's God's presence and activity within the world, it often sees this immanence as secondary to God's transcendence, almost as a consequence of it.
So the emphasis is on God's otherness, which raises some thorny philosophical questions about how that divine world interaction actually works.
Precisely. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have pantheism, which goes in the opposite direction. It stresses the ontological identity of God and the world, blurring the distinction between the two.
So in pantheism, the world might be seen as simply a mode or manifestation of God, right? There's a sense of necessity that God's nature compels this expression in creation.
Exactly. And this is where panentheism stakes out its unique territory. It wholeheartedly affirms God's deep and pervasive presence in the world. That's the immanence part. But it also maintains the distinct reality and value of the non-divine. The world isn't just an appearance of God. It has its own integrity, even as it exists within God.
That in seems really important, this idea of a profound interconnectedness without collapsing into identity. It's not absorption, it's something more subtle than that.
Exactly. It's a very nuanced relationship. And this brings us to how panentheism reinterprets the concept of transcendence. Unlike the traditional view of God being out there, separate from the world, thinkers like Hegel and Hartshorne offered a different perspective. They conceived of transcendence as including all the constituents of the world within God. The idea is to avoid the philosophical problem of something existing outside of God that could limit God. So God's transcendence becomes this all-encompassing embrace, a maximal reality that contains all other realities.
So rather than transcendence meaning separation, it means a kind of radical inclusion.
You could say that. And when it comes to immanence, panentheists argue that classical theism often limits this concept because of its starting point of radical transcendence.
So for panentheists, God's immanence is more fundamental, more intrinsic to God's being.
Exactly. Because God isn't limited by any external reality, God can be present in every facet of existence. It's a deep constitutive presence, not just a superficial indwelling.
It's about God being the very ground of being.
Precisely. Now, another term we encounter frequently in these discussions is kenosis, which means divine self-emptying.
Right. Traditionally, kenosis refers to God's voluntary limitation of power, especially in the incarnation of Christ or God's relationship with creation.
Right. It's often seen as an act of divine will, a choice God makes. But some panentheists, like Thomas J. Ord, take a different approach. He proposes that this self-giving, other-empowering nature of God isn't just a choice, but is intrinsic to God's very being. It's not a decision. It's a fundamental expression of God's nature.
So, for Ord, kenosis is essential to who God is. It's not something God does, it's something God is.
Exactly. And this idea of a self-giving God resonates deeply with panentheism's emphasis on a God who is intimately involved in the world.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the influence of German idealism on panentheism. Thinkers like Hegel and Schelling loom large in the background here.
They do. And a central concept from German idealism that shapes panentheistic thought is the dialectic. This is the idea of seemingly contradictory realities or ideas interacting and ultimately leading to a higher level synthesis. It's about finding a way to hold together apparent opposites and arrive at a more comprehensive understanding.
So instead of just choosing one side or the other, the dialectic tries to integrate both sides into a greater whole.
Right. And this resonates with how some panentheists try to reconcile divine transcendence and immanence, not as mutually exclusive, but as complementary aspects of God's reality.
I can see how that would be helpful in this context. And what about the concept of the infinite? In traditional theology, it's often understood as simply the absence of limits. Do panentheists offer a different perspective?
They do. While acknowledging the traditional view, they often emphasize a more positive and expansive understanding of the infinite. It's not just about what God isn't finite, but about the inclusion of all that is and all that could be. It's the realm of all possibilities.
So it's not just boundless, but also the source of boundless possibility. That's a really interesting way to think about it.
It is, and it connects to the idea of God being affected by the world, because this realm of possibilities is constantly being actualized in the unfolding of creation.
Okay, and then there's the term perichoresis, which sounds pretty technical. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure, perichoresis comes from Trinitarian theology. It describes the intimate, mutual indwelling of the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's a way of understanding how they are distinct, yet completely interpenetrated, each fully present in the others, without losing their individual identities.
It's about a profound relatedness where the distinctions are real, but the unity is also real.
Exactly. And thinkers like Jürgen Moltmann have extended this concept to the relationship between God and the world. So it's not just about God being out there or in here, but about a mutual interpenetration, God in the world and the world in God.
So German idealism provides one set of conceptual tools for thinking about panentheism. What about process philosophy? What key concepts from that tradition are essential?
Process philosophy, pioneered by thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, brings a crucial emphasis on internal relations. Unlike external relations, which don't fundamentally change the nature of the related entities, internal relations are constitutive. They shape the very being of what's related.
So, for process panentheism, the relationship between God and the world isn't just external. It's not just God acting on the world.
Right. It's much deeper than that. God doesn't just influence the world. God is also influenced by the world. It's a relationship of mutual constitution.
And the idea of God being dipolar is central to process thought, right?
It is. This means that God has two fundamental aspects. Whitehead called them God's primordial nature and God's consequent nature. The primordial nature is the realm of eternal possibilities, while the consequent nature is God's reception of the world's actual experiences. Hartshorne talked about abstract and concrete poles.
So God is both unchanging in the sense of always offering possibilities and also changing in the sense of being affected by what happens in the world.
Right. And this helps process panentheism address the classic problem of reconciling divine immutability with God's involvement in a changing world.
It's a dynamic picture of God, always in process. Now, we also encounter the idea of panpsychism in discussions of process panentheism. What role does that play?
Panpsychism is the view that all entities, even down to the most fundamental level, have some form of mind or experience. It's not necessarily full-blown consciousness as we humans experience it, but a basic form of mentality or feeling.
So it's the idea that the universe isn't just dead matter, but has an inherent experiential dimension.
Exactly. And this connects to process panentheism in the sense that if all things have this experiential dimension, then God, as the ultimate reality, can be conceived as being related to and aware of every aspect of the world in a very intimate way.
That's an intriguing connection. Now let's bring in some contemporary scientific ideas that are influencing modern panentheistic thought. Our sources talk about things like research programs, dualism, reductionism, supervenience, and emergence.
Right. There's a lot of fertile ground for dialogue between science and theology here. For instance, the idea of a research program borrowed from philosophy of science is used by thinkers like Philip Clayton to suggest that we can approach theological questions with a similar rigor and openness to empirical data.
So it's about treating panentheism as a kind of ongoing inquiry, constantly being tested and refined in light of our growing scientific understanding.
Exactly. And when it comes to dualism, the traditional separation of mind and matter, panentheists generally reject the idea that they are completely separate substances. Instead, they tend to favor more unified views.
So instead of two radically different kinds of stuff, they see mind and matter as different aspects or expressions of a more fundamental reality.
Right. And this relates to the idea of reductionism, which claims that everything can ultimately be reduced to its simplest physical components. Panentheists tend to be skeptical of this kind of strong reductionism.
Because they see the world as exhibiting genuine levels of complexity with properties that can't just be explained away by reducing everything to its most basic parts.
Exactly. And this is where supervenience and emergence come in. Supervenience describes a relationship of dependence without reduction. So mental states might supervene on brain states, but they're not simply reducible to them.
And emergence is the idea that new properties and levels of complexity arise from the interaction of simpler components.
Right. And panentheists, especially those engaging with science, see emergence as a crucial concept for understanding how God can be intimately present in the world without being identical to or reducible to its physical parts.
So instead of God being the separate intervening force, God's presence is more like the ground or condition for the emergence of complexity and novelty.
You could put it that way. It's about God being the source of possibility, the ultimate ground of being, but the world also having its own integrity and agency within that.
Okay, and what about top-down causation and entanglement? Those are some pretty mind-bending ideas from physics. How do they figure into panentheistic thought?
Top-down causation is the idea that higher-level organizations can influence lower levels, like how our thoughts and intentions can affect our physical actions. It's a controversial idea, but some panentheists see it as a way to understand how God, as the highest level of reality, might influence the world without needing to intervene in a supernatural way.
So it's not about God breaking the laws of nature, but about God's influence being woven into the very fabric of reality.
Right. And entanglement is the phenomenon in quantum mechanics, where two particles become linked, so that what happens to one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. This idea of non-local connection is sometimes used as a way to think about God's relationship to the world.
So it's a metaphor for the deep interconnectedness of reality, even at the most fundamental levels.
Exactly. And it challenges our usual notions of causality and locality. Now, after exploring these various concepts, we need to address the meaning of that central preposition, in. What does it mean to say that the world is in God?
Right. We've touched on some of the different interpretations, but it's worth really unpacking them.
Absolutely. First of all, we can rule out the purely spatial or locative meaning because God isn't usually conceived as having a physical location. So the in has to be understood in a more metaphysical sense.
Okay, so what are some of those metaphysical interpretations?
Well, one is the idea that the world's existence is grounded in God's being. So the world exists and continues to exist because it participates in God's reality. This is sometimes called the metaphysical basis for being.
So the world is in God in the sense that it depends on God for its very being. It's
Yeah.
like the world is grounded in God's reality.
Right. Another interpretation emphasizes the epistemological aspect. Karl Kraus argued that our ability to know the world is rooted in its presence in God. So the world is in God in the sense that God is the ultimate source of intelligibility.
That's an interesting perspective. It connects the in to the possibility of knowledge itself. What other interpretations are there?
Some focus on the dynamic, interactive nature of the relationship. The metaphysical interactive potential interpretation highlights the unpredictable self-organizing aspect of the God-world relationship. It's not a static deterministic system, but a dynamic interplay.
So the world is in God in the sense that it's constantly being shaped and reshaped by its relationship with God. And God is also being shaped by the world to some extent.
Exactly. And then there are several analogies that are used to understand the in. One is the emergence metaphor, where the world is seen as emerging from a divine source, like the complexity of a plant emerging from a seed.
So God is the ground or the seed, and the world is the flower that blossoms from it.
Right. Another is the mind-body analogy, which sees the world as analogous to God's body. This emphasizes God's immanence and presence throughout creation.
So the world is in God, like our bodies are in our minds. They're expressions of us, yet distinct from us.
Precisely. And finally, the part-whole analogy sees the world as a part of God's larger reality. This emphasizes God's all-encompassing nature.
So the world is in God, like the pieces of a puzzle are in the completed picture. They each have their own identity, but they only make sense as part of the larger whole.
Right. So there are a lot of different ways to understand the in of panentheism. It's a rich and nuanced concept.
It sounds like it. Now that we've explored the terminology, let's delve into the history of panentheistic thought. It's not a new idea, is it?
Not at all. While the term panentheism itself was coined in the 19th century, the underlying intuitions and ideas have been around for much longer.
So where do we see these early glimmers of panentheistic thinking?
We can find hints of it in various religious and philosophical traditions. In ancient Egypt, for instance, the pharaoh Akhenaten's hymns to the sun god Aten seem to express a kind of cosmic monotheism that could be interpreted as having panentheistic elements. In India, some aspects of early Vedantic thought, with its concept of Brahman as both immanent and transcendent, also resonate with panentheistic ideas.
So it's not confined to any one culture or religion. These ideas have been bubbling up in different parts of the world for centuries. What about in classical Greek philosophy?
Yes, we find some interesting connections there as well. Plato's distinction between the eternal forms and the dynamic world soul has been interpreted by some scholars, like Hartshorne, as a kind of early dipolar thinking. Plotinus, with his Neoplatonic idea of emanation, also seems to anticipate some aspects of panentheism. And Baltzly even finds panentheistic tendencies in Plato's Timaeus itself.
So Plato's role in the development of panentheism is still debated, but there are certainly some intriguing connections there.
Right. And as we move into the Middle Ages, Neoplatonic thought continues to be influential. Figures like Proclus and Pseudo-Dionysius developed sophisticated ideas about the relationship between God and the world that have a distinctly panentheistic flavor.
And what about medieval thinkers like Eriugena, Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, and Bohm?
They all wrestled with the idea of God's immanence and transcendence in ways that prefigure later panentheistic thought. While sometimes accused of pantheism, they articulated views that emphasized God's intimate presence in the world while still affirming God's distinctness.
So it's a complex and evolving conversation. As we transition into the early modern period, do we see these panentheistic threads continue?
Absolutely. Thinkers like Giordano Bruno and Baruch Spinoza grappled with the relationship between God and nature in ways that, while not always explicitly panentheistic, certainly contributed to the development of the concept.
Spinoza, in particular, is often seen as a precursor to pantheism, but his emphasis on God's immanence and the interconnectedness of all things also resonated with later panentheists.
Right, and then you have figures like the Cambridge Platonists, Jonathan Edwards, and Friedrich Schleiermacher, who all developed ideas about the world being, in some sense, within God or dependent on God in ways that foreshadow later panentheistic formulations.
So it seems like there's a growing awareness of the need to find a way to think about God's relationship to the world that goes beyond the limitations of both classical theism and pantheism.
Exactly. And this brings us to the 19th and 20th centuries, where panentheism really emerges as a distinct and self-conscious position.
What were the key factors driving this development?
Two main forces were at work. One was the resurgence of philosophical idealism, particularly with figures like Hegel and Schelling. They thought to find a way to affirm God's immanence without collapsing into pantheism. The other was the impact of evolutionary thinking, which challenged traditional notions of a static, unchanging world and a God who simply created the world and then stepped back.
So it was a time of intellectual ferment when old ideas were being questioned and new ways of thinking were emerging.
Absolutely. And in this context, Carl Christian Friedrich Krauss coined the term panentheism in 1828 to distinguish this view from pantheism. He emphasized the idea of all in God and God over all.
So the term is relatively recent, but the ideas have deep roots.
Right. And then, in the 20th century, process philosophy, developed by Whitehead and Hartshorne, became a major force in articulating and defending a panentheistic view of God and the world.
What are the core ideas of process panentheism?
Process panentheism emphasizes the dynamic, interconnected nature of reality. It sees God as being involved in the world's ongoing becoming, being affected by the world's experiences, and yet also providing the ground of possibility for the world's creativity.
So it's a very relational and dynamic picture of both God and the world. God is not static and unchanging, but is constantly in process, responding to the world and offering new possibilities.
Exactly. And process panentheism also has a unique approach to the problem of evil, arguing that God doesn't unilaterally control the world and therefore isn't directly responsible for evil, but rather suffers with the world and works to redeem even the negative aspects of experience.
Okay, so we've traced the historical development of panentheism. Now, let's shift our focus to the contemporary scene. What does panentheism look like today?
It's a diverse and vibrant landscape. You find thinkers from various backgrounds, scientists, theologians from different Christian denominations, feminist philosophers, and even those working within other religious traditions engaging with panentheistic ideas.
So it's not just a narrow theological position, but a broader philosophical perspective that's finding resonance in many different fields.
Right. And the ways in which panentheism is being articulated and developed today are incredibly varied.
Mhm.
You have thinkers like Jürgen Moltmann, who draws on his background in German idealism to develop a Trinitarian panentheism that emphasizes God's self-emptying love and the mutual indwelling of God and the world.
And David Ray Griffin, a leading proponent of process panentheism, has been particularly influential in engaging with contemporary science and developing a panentheistic worldview that's both scientifically informed and theologically robust.
Yes, Griffin's work has been crucial in bridging the gap between science and religion, showing how panentheism can provide a coherent and compelling framework for understanding the world in light of our best scientific knowledge.
And what about figures like Arthur Peacock and Paul Davies? They come from a scientific background but have been drawn to panentheistic ideas. What's the connection there?
Peacock, drawing on his expertise in biochemistry, saw God as the continuous creator, working through the natural processes of the universe. He emphasized the immanence of God's action within the unfolding of natural laws. Davies, a physicist and cosmologist, explored the universe's inherent complexity and the fine-tuning of natural laws, suggesting a co-creative relationship between God and the cosmos that aligns more with panentheism than with deism.
So for these scientists, panentheism provides a way to integrate their scientific understanding of the world with a belief in a God who is intimately involved in creation.
Exactly. And then you have Philip Clayton, who's a key figure in bridging the realms of science and theology. He advocates for a scientifically informed panentheism that emphasizes the internal relationship between God and the world, drawing heavily on concepts of emergence and relationality.
So Clayton's work is all about showing how panentheism can make sense in light of our best scientific understanding of the universe.
Right. And he's also been influential in developing a Trinitarian and kenotic panentheism that emphasizes God's self-giving love and the mutual dependence of God and the world.
Panentheism also seems to resonate with some feminist theologians. What are the key reasons for this connection?
Well, many feminist theologians have critiqued traditional notions of God as a transcendent, patriarchal figure who is distant from the world and who reinforces hierarchies that have historically marginalized women and nature.
So they're drawn to panentheism's emphasis on God's immanence, relationality, and interconnectedness. It's a way of thinking about God that's more aligned with feminist values.
Exactly. Thinkers like Sally McFague have been influential in developing feminist interpretations of panentheism, using metaphors like the world as God's body to emphasize God's intimate presence throughout creation.
It's a powerful way to reimagine the divine in a way that's more inclusive and egalitarian.
It is, and it's important to note that there's a diversity of views within feminist panentheism. Some thinkers, like Anna Case Winters, caution against interpretations that might collapse God and the world into one, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the world's distinct otherness in relation to God.
So it's not a monolithic movement, but a rich and ongoing conversation. And it's fascinating to see how panentheism is also finding points of connection with various world religions.
Absolutely. Scholars have noted affinities between panentheism and certain strands of Hindu thought, especially the idea of the world as the body of the divine. There are also resonances with certain interpretations of Judaism, Jainism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Sufism.
So while panentheism has its roots in Western philosophy and theology, it's finding a wider audience and sparking conversations across religious boundaries.
Right. It's a reminder that these fundamental questions about the relationship between the divine and the world are shared by many different traditions. And panentheism offers a way to think about them that can be both intellectually rigorous and spiritually satisfying.
Now that we've surveyed the historical development and contemporary expressions of panentheism, let's delve a bit deeper into the nature of the God-world relation itself. We've touched on some of the complexities, but what are the key aspects that demand closer philosophical scrutiny?
One crucial aspect is the use of metaphors. While metaphors are indispensable tools for talking about God, they also have limitations. And one metaphor that has been particularly controversial is the idea of the world as God's body.
Right. We've talked about that metaphor before. What are some of the concerns that philosophers have raised about it?
Some worry that it might lead to a kind of substantialism, blurring the distinction between God and the world, and potentially compromising both God's transcendence and the world's own integrity. Others have concerns about how this metaphor accounts for creaturely freedom and the problem of evil. If the world is God's body, then how can we explain suffering and evil?
It seems like a metaphor that requires careful handling. And what about that central word, in? We've explored various interpretations, but how do these different understandings shape the very nature of the God-world relationship in panentheism?
As we've discussed, the in can't be understood in a purely spatial or locative sense. It has to be understood metaphysically. And the different interpretations we've explored highlight different aspects of this relationship.
Right. Some interpretations emphasize the world's ontological dependence on God, while others focus on the epistemological dimension or the dynamic, interactive nature of the relationship.
Exactly. And each interpretation brings with it a different set of philosophical challenges and possibilities.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer to the question of what it means for the world to be in God.
Right. It's a multifaceted concept that requires careful philosophical analysis.
Beyond the use of metaphors, what are some of the more precise metaphysical understandings of this relationship that have been proposed?
Well, Schelling, in his later thought, developed the concept of emanation that emphasized the free unfolding of the divine, including subjectivity. Krauss stressed the world's active participation in God's being, both ontologically and epistemologically, and Catherine Keller speaks of a dynamic chaosmos, a mingling of unpredictable, self-organizing relations.
So there are various attempts to articulate the God-world relationship in more precise metaphysical terms.
Right. And the engagement with science has also led to new ways of thinking about this relationship, using concepts like supervenience and emergence to ground panentheistic claims in our understanding of the natural world.
What about the fundamental ontological basis for this mutual relation? What is the nature of being for both God and the world that makes this kind of interconnectedness possible?
That's a crucial question. Some thinkers rely on analogy to bridge the gap between divine and creaturely being, while others argue for the necessity of maintaining a fundamental ontological difference to safeguard divine freedom and agency.
And process thought, with its emphasis on relational ontologies, provides another way to think about this, suggesting that relationships are more fundamental than the individual entities themselves.
Exactly. And this relational ontology naturally lends itself to understanding a God who is intrinsically related to and affected by the world.
So there are different approaches to this question of ontological grounding, but they all share a commitment to finding a way to understand how God and the world can be both distinct and deeply interconnected.
Right. And historically, we see different panentheistic traditions grappling with this question in various ways. The concept of participation, with roots in Plato and Augustine, suggests that the world's existence is derived from and somehow partakes in God's being. Hegelian dynamic ontology posits an infinite reality that gives rise to the finite through a dialectical process. And process dynamic ontology, with its dipolar view of God, sees God as both the source of possibilities and the recipient of the world's actualizations.
So it's a rich and complex history of philosophical reflection. And what about contemporary attempts to provide more precise accounts of this ontological relation?
Thinkers like John Bracken, drawing on systems theory and Whitehead's concept of society, have proposed sophisticated models for understanding how God and the world are related. Bracken's Trinitarian field theory, for instance, sees the world as a finite field existing within the all-encompassing field of the divine persons.
And what about Carl A.P. Rett-Cazalis?
Cazalis uses category theory and mathematical concepts to offer a more formal and precise specification of the panentheistic relation.
It's fascinating to see how contemporary thinkers are drawing on a variety of resources, from philosophy of science to mathematics, to articulate the God-world relationship in more rigorous and nuanced ways.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the philosophical vitality of panentheism and its ability to engage with cutting-edge thought. Now, of course, no philosophical position is without its critics, and panentheism has faced its share of objections from various perspectives.
Right. Let's dive into some of those criticisms. Where do we start?
Well, one common line of criticism comes from pantheists and those operating from naturalistic assumptions. They often argue that panentheism is an unnecessary halfway house. If God and the world are so intimately connected, why not just say they're identical?
So, from this perspective, panentheism is seen as adding unnecessary complexity by positing a God who is distinct from the world.
Exactly. Critics like Robert Corrington, Willem B. Dries, and Nancy Frankenberry have raised a range of objections along these lines, questioning the coherence of freedom within holistic relations, the applicability of the body-soul analogy to the God-world relationship, the persistence of value in a panentheistic framework, and even the ontological argument itself. Michael Gillett has also questioned panentheism's ability to explain causal efficacy, given the close relationship between God and the world.
And how do panentheists typically respond to these naturalistic critiques?
Panentheists generally argue that purely reductionistic naturalism is inadequate, both scientifically and metaphysically. They point to the emergent complexity of the universe, arguing that higher-level phenomena can't be fully explained by reducing them to their most basic physical components. They also appeal to the idea of downward causation, suggesting that higher levels of reality can exert influence on lower levels.
So, it's about affirming the reality of emergence and the irreducibility of complex phenomena.
Exactly. And some panentheists have also explored how concepts like quantum entanglement might provide new ways of understanding causation and the role of the divine within the natural world.
Okay, what about theological criticisms of panentheism? What are some of the concerns raised from within religious traditions?
One central concern is that panentheism might offer an inadequate or diminished concept of God. Some critics worry that it compromises God's transcendence, immutability, and omnipotence. If God is affected by the world, doesn't that make God less than fully divine?
So the worry is that panentheism might make God too much like us, too finite and limited.
Right. Thinkers like John Cooper, Marcus Leidenhag, and Miroslav Tabachek have raised concerns about how panentheism affects traditional attributes of God. They argue that it might lead to a God who is too changeable, too dependent on the world, and ultimately too weak to be the God of classical theism.
And how do panentheists respond to these theological critiques?
Panentheists generally argue that their understanding of divine transcendence is more nuanced and sophisticated than simply God being out there and separate from the world. They emphasize God's immanence and relationality without denying God's fundamental difference from creation.
So it's not about denying transcendence, but about rethinking what it means.
Exactly. They also argue that their concept of God doesn't necessarily diminish God's power or immutability. They might, for instance, distinguish between God's essential nature, which is unchanging, and God's experiential nature, which is affected by the world.
So it's about finding a way to affirm both God's constancy and God's responsiveness to the world.
Right. And they might also point to the idea of top-down causation as a way to understand God's influence on the world without resorting to supernatural interventions.
Okay, what about God's causal influence more broadly? Are there specific criticisms about how panentheism accounts for God action in the world?
Yes, some critics, like Marcus Leidenhag, argue that if God is so intimately connected to the world,